They're two happy women bringing you inspiring stories, politics, pop culture, and lifestyle hacks, all with an eye to making our communities and our country a better place to live. It's the Happy Women Podcast with your hosts, Jen Horn and Katie Gorka.
Thanks for joining us. It's another episode of the Happy Women Podcast. I'm Katie Gorka. My friend and superhero of the airwaves, Jennifer Horn, can't be here today, but I'm happy to carry the Happy Women torch on her behalf for today's interview, which I am super excited about. So let me just build up to what we're about to do here. This is a really interesting one to me at a very personal level, because you all know that I too have a new book out called Next Gen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It. And a big part of that book, which I co-wrote with my heritage colleague, Mike Gonzalez, is how did we get here? How did we get to where our children are on the front line of the culture war, where schools are promoting pornographic books, the transgender cult is arguing that it's okay to mutilate children, and where our churches closed down for COVID? But, you know, in addition to talking about how we got here, Mike and I talked a lot about the way out. So we outlined a whole host of steps that we can all be taking to end this insanity. And two of the important ones that we identified, one was exposing what the radical left is trying to accomplish. And the second is following the money. So my guest today has done both of those things in her incredible new book. I have Megan Basham here with us, and her book is Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. Megan, welcome to the Happy Women Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Katie. I'm so excited to be here. As a happy woman, so.
Yes, absolutely. We wanted to have you because we know you're a happy woman. So thanks for being here. So before we dive into the book, I have so many questions. I've actually been deeply immersed in the book. I've read it cover to cover, absolutely loved it. Before we dive into your book, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the path that you took to getting here. How did you get to the point where you are taking on some of the biggest names in mainstream Christianity?
Well, you know, a big part of it was simply that I was one of those ordinary Christians in the pews experiencing the concerns that so many people reached out to me about as they were experiencing it in their churches. So we were at a different church at that period, right around 2018 to 2020. Attending a mainstream evangelical church, my kids in a Christian school. I worked for an evangelical magazine. So I was certainly someone who was very much immersed in that world. And like so many other people, I started to see things that were just setting off alarm bells. One of the earliest was in 2019 as a member of a Southern Baptist church in the Southern Baptist Convention. If you're not familiar with that, that is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S. I saw that they were putting forth critical race theory as an analytical tool that Christians might want to embrace. That was surprising to me. It was the first time I heard that term, but the way I saw it playing out was certainly very divisive in churches. In the church we were at that time, our children's ministry director sent out an email encouraging parents to talk to their kids about their white privilege. So these were the first things that sort of set me off writing about this topic. And then, of course, COVID hit. And like so many other Christians, how I saw the church handling that was disturbing, to say the least. And not only closing their churches, unquestioningly submitting to local vaccine mandates, mask mandates, segregating their churches in some cases, saying you can't come if you're not masked or have proof of vaccination. And so as all of that was going on, I started covering it, wrote a very viral story about Francis Collins, former head of the National Institutes of Health, who was heavily promoted by high-profile evangelical leaders, though he had a record that certainly should have caused them to look at him at the very least with skepticism in terms of abortion and promoting that transgender agenda that you mentioned. So at that point, a publisher approached me and just said, your viral reporting on this seems like something that should be a book. And so here we are.
Wow. Well, I'm going to say God bless them, because so many publishers won't touch the types of content that you and I write about. So I'm grateful to them that they had the idea, they approached you, and they were brave enough to publish this. So amen to that. All right. There's so many topics that I want to dive into, but let's start with illegal immigration. So one of the things that you mentioned is a June 2016 DC Leaks publication where they put out a trove of documents that revealed Soros was using billions of dollars to buy access to Democratic politicians in order to manipulate elections, but he was also buying access to evangelical leaders. So let's maybe start with this, because I thought this was an incredible story, that there was a whole group of pastors who ended up condemning Trump's immigration policies. And what you reveal is there may have been money behind that position. So tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so that was one of the big topics where I spent a lot of time tracing money. So for those who aren't familiar, there is a group called the Evangelical Immigration Table. It's very influential. Among its coalition members include Christianity Today and its editor-in-chief, Russell Moore, the National Association of Evangelicals, which represents some 45,000 churches in dozens of different evangelical denominations, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, which represents roughly 85 member schools, well-recognized, trusted evangelical schools like Biola, many other schools that are in the Azusa Pacific. So this is not a fringe organization. Well, if you trace how it formed, you go back to 2015, it was created as part of the National Immigration Forum. That is a secular left group that had been heavily funded by George Soros. It was estimated that in its first couple of years of existence, it took millions of dollars, around $3 million from George Soros to get going. And they realized that they had a problem getting these immigration policies, open border policies that people like George Soros favor, pathways to citizenship, legal status, lifting caps on refugees, things of that nature, across the finish line. And so they realized they needed to do something about evangelicals. And that is why they established this organization within the National Immigration Forum. So if you look at the Evangelical Immigration Table, legally, there is no separation between the National Immigration Forum and this group. They have no different legal status. They don't exist apart from the National Immigration Forum. And so part of what came out in those DC leaks was not only that George Soros was funneling money into the National Immigration Forum, but that the Evangelical Immigration Table became a particular project that he funded through an initiative called Bibles, Badges, and Business. And its purpose was to specifically mobilize conservative constituencies to convince their Republican lawmakers that actually conservatives really want these kind of open borders immigration policies. And in fact, when you look at the leaked documents that came from Soros's own foundation, Open Society, what you see is they specifically talk about, we used the National Immigration Forum to get access to evangelicals. Specifically, they talk about the Southern Baptists, which again, largest Protestant denomination in the US. So they laud how they were able to gain access to Southern Baptists through the National Immigration Forum and its partner, the Evangelical Immigration Table. So that was very much a follow the money story. And it's a really timely topic right now, because if you look at some of the things that the Evangelical Immigration Table has lobbied for, they lobbied against Trump lowering the refugee cap on nations known to harbor terrorists. They were very outspoken against that. They called it xenophobic. They also lobbied for President Biden to end Donald Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which was a very reasonable policy that required immigrants coming to the United States through other nations to seek asylum in the nations they were crossing through first. Very reasonable, common sense policy. They lobbied against that. So that's the kind of activities that this group is involved in.
I think this one gets to me particularly because, I served in the Trump administration at the very end. I served as the press secretary for Customs and Border Protection. And in that capacity, I was able to go down and visit the border and visit some of these facilities. And I think the thing that too many Americans don't realize is that the policies that have been in place, this whole notion of, don't separate families, what that means, it is an incentive to traffic children, because what it means is if you come with children who you claim are yours, you will be allowed into the country. You will not be separated, right? And it sounds so humanitarian, like, don't separate the families. But first of all, we don't do anything to prove whether these are actually families, whether these are blood relatives. And I just, I think the one image that stays with me the most is I came into this warehouse, literally a warehouse of probably 200 children. And one of them was a 7-year-old Down syndrome girl, just sort of left to herself on a mat by the floor. She had been brought into the country by an adult male claiming to be her father, who was long gone. Whatever happens to kids like this. And so the fact that you've got evangelical leaders arguing against immigration reform, and this has nothing to do with stopping the flow of legal immigrants. It has everything to do with stopping the flow of illegal immigrants, and particularly stopping the incentive for child trafficking. So I just was really so upset when I discovered, this story that you tell about how these leaders were, there's no other word for it, how they were corrupted by money to stand against what were very, very smart, humane policies of the Trump administration.
Yeah. And two things I want to point out about that, Katie. So one is that once Trump was out of office and the Biden administration came into office, suddenly their concerns over so many of these issues just disappeared. When the Biden administration said they were not going to be letting in Cuban refugees and asylum seekers who we know were facing real persecution. And we're talking about a heavily Christian Catholic population there in Cuba. They said nothing. There was no outcry from these same leaders. And in terms of what you're talking about with the sex trafficking of children and really child slave labor that we've seen because of these this commitment to supposedly not separate families that we don't actually know are families and we don't know who these children are going to, they have been silent on that issue as well. So I think that's really telling about just how political this is. They want to pretend that this is a biblical, a spiritual, a Christian conviction. And in fact, they apply very much a double standard when it comes to these things. And I always want people to understand that when they hear these leaders involved with the evangelical immigration table talking about ministering, they're talking about explicitly political lobbying. They don't go down to the border and distribute food. They don't distribute Bibles. They don't spread the gospel. They're talking only about lobbying policymakers.
I hear you. All right, let's shift to COVID-19 because this is such a sore spot for so many people, right? I know. And this was, I think for Christians especially, the fact that we were told we could not attend our churches. It happened to us with our church. And I'm sorry, the other one that just killed me was the fact that you could go in there and you could recite the Lord's Prayer, but you can't sing. Right. I mean, it was so ridiculous. Okay. So I think, this is the viral report that you mentioned, right?
Yes.
In February 21, you published a report in the Daily Wire that went viral on how evangelical leaders had helped the director of the National Institutes for Health, Francis Collins, spread COVID-19 disinformation. This, I thought, was a stunning story as well. You made a couple of great points here. One was their outright hypocrisy, that they would condemn fellow Christians for still gathering, for those few who defied the shutdown orders. But yet they had no problems with the Black Lives Matter gatherings, right? The other thing that I found really stunning in your reporting is the degree to which they disparaged their fellow pastors and fellow Christians, going so far as to call them bad Christians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in a very real way, they were getting their marching orders from Francis Collins and the federal government in terms of how they spoke about it and how they handled it. Some very well-known churches, the church founded by the late Tim Keller in New York City, which is revered among evangelicals, Redeemer Presbyterian. They not only shut down for a very long time, they are also one of those churches who did what I mentioned there in terms of segregating their church bodies in terms of vaccination status. And what was really interesting about that was how it was clearly not based in science, because they said that kids under, I think it was 15, but I can't remember, who were not vaccinated were free to sit with their vaccinated parents on the floor of the sanctuary, where the unvaccinated had to sit in a special area upstairs. And that just scientifically made no sense, because if a 15-year-old had COVID, he could just as easily spread it. And so all of these policies were put in place because they were accepting what was the official narrative from Washington, D.C. and its officials. And part of what they did was they promoted Francis Collins. Tim Keller was one of those. The famous Rick Warren of Saddleback Church, the mega church. And of course, he's the author of The Purpose-Driven Life, celebrated theologian N.T. Wright. All of them brought Francis Collins out. Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition referenced him. And they said that Christians who were questioning in really reasonable ways, questioning things like, did this virus come out of a Wuhan lab? Did China specifically develop it with any sense of using it as some sort of bioweapon? These were reasonable questions. They called this conspiracy theorizing, and they really spiritually shamed Christians who had these reasonable questions and said that they were engaged in sinful activities and damaging the reputation of Christ by asking very reasonable questions. And, you know, part of what they did in promoting Francis Collins was they kept emphasizing that this is one of our faithful Christian brothers. And then you looked at Francis Collins' record, and it was really appalling to me, that part of the story, that they continually tried to tell us that this was such a faithful Christian man, really upholding the witness of the church in the halls of power. When you look at his record, he is somebody who has fought to ensure that there would be continued traffic in aborted baby parts, and that there would continue to be research on fetal tissue from abortions. Not just that, he spearheaded an LGBTQ initiative that he himself celebrated and patted himself on the back for, that included transgender research on children, included giving cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, mastectomies to girls as young as 12. So this is part of Francis Collins' record. And of course, these leaders have never answered questions about why they promoted Francis Collins, knowing that. And in fact, some of them, like Russell Moore, Christianity Today editor-in-chief, again, clearly knew, based on other leaked audio, that this was Francis Collins' record and refused to ever acknowledge it.
Volatility and uncertainty are everywhere we turn. Many Americans have grown increasingly tired of the reckless fiscal spending, mounting national debt, and the looming threat to the dollar. With never-ending political and global conflicts, Americans are looking for a way out of the fragile paper system and craving a trustworthy asset to help protect their savings. That's why they turn to gold. Specifically, a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. If you have over $100,000 in a retirement account, it's time you learned about the potential benefits of a gold IRA from Augusta Precious Metals. Augusta Precious Metals is a world-class organization that prides itself on top-notch service. Ready to learn more? Get your free guide on gold IRAs today by calling 855-222-6994. Volatility is everywhere. Now is the time to take control of your retirement to secure a brighter financial future with Augusta Precious Metals. Call them at 855-222-6994 today. What I also found really stunning about your reporting on this is the fact that now so much of what we know from these dissident Christians, they were right. Right? All the things that got dismissed as conspiracy theories. And yet the people who condemn them, unless something has changed since you published the book, none of them has expressed remorse. None of them has apologized, right? Nothing.
No, none. And in fact, not just that, I can tell you Christianity Today ran an essay basically saying we all just need to move on from the debates we had over COVID. And by the way, you guys were still mean as far as the critics in the pews. So that was kind of funny that in fact, they used it as a further claim that people are just being mean to them.
I mean, I just have to ask, does anybody actually still read Christianity Today?
Well, so here's the thing. I don't think many people in the rank and file do. The ordinary people in the pews don't. But you will still find their leaders very much published in its pages. And you find them being invited to all of these Christian campuses. I can tell you just this last weekend at Wheaton, they had a big event with the After Party, which is a political Bible study exclusively funded by hard left secular foundations. They brought one of the and Russell Moore of Christianity Today helped create that. And they brought another one of the members of that organization out to do an event. And so those kinds of organizations, those kind of campuses, Christian churches, think tanks, they do still have them out. And so when you look at the next generation, you and I may sit here and go, please, Christianity Today, but your 23-year-old seminary student doesn't know that. And so when they bring out, here's Christianity Today, editor-in-chief Russell Moore to come speak on our campus, the kids show up. They're told to go to these things. They're told this is a man you can respect. And that's part of what I would call very much a grift continues to happen, that they respectability launder the reputations of these men to try to continue to convince the next generation of Christians that you need to listen to these people.
I did come away from your book feeling like there's this whole sort of elitist cabal. And I think it has its analogy in the political world, which is the kind of the elitists who will not support Trump, but they'll support Nikki Haley, or who even now will say, because I can't support Trump, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris without actually really thinking all that hard about the policy choice that they're making in that. I saw something similar going on that you described in the world of Christianity, that there's an elitist group, like the fact that Rick Warren goes to Davos just killed me, and that there are others that go to the leftist Aspen Institute gatherings. And I was particularly struck by what you revealed about Trinity Forum, which, again, that hit very close to home. I've been to their events. Oz Guinness lives just down the street. I think the world of him. So, he was the founder of that, but they've gone, I'm going to say they've gone hard left. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because they've been seduced by, the elitism and the money that is being offered to them by these elite organizations. And if I'm not mistaken, I think you said Trinity Forum is getting funding from Pierre Omidyar. Where are they getting their funding from?
That's correct. Yes. Among others. Yes. Pierre Omidyar, who, for those who don't know, is not a Christian. He founded eBay. He's a Buddhist. He's taken a strong interest in funding media organizations. So one of the things, in addition to Trinity Forum, that he funded was The Intercept, with Glenn Greenwald. So he started that organization. And what's so funny is that Glenn Greenwald, who is a man of the left himself, but a classical liberal, said he had to leave because the publication would not let him run articles that were critical of Joe Biden in the run-up to the 2020 election. And he said this, he said that liberal billionaires will only fund liberal causes. And so now you see Buddhist eBay founder Pierre Omidyar funding this supposedly Christian organization, supposedly conservative. And when you look at that, I don't think it's so surprising then to see the people that Trinity Forum now promotes. It includes people like the feminist left-wing professor, Kristen Dumais, who you might have heard of her book, Jesus and John Wayne, which claims even people like Billy Graham have been promoting a kind of white supremacist patriarchalism. It promotes people like Michael Ware is one of their newer fellows who came out of the Obama administration. He was an architect of Evangelicals for Biden in 2020. Of course, it promotes David French, who is another one of its new fellows. I'm sure everyone knows David French, who is now endorsing Kamala Harris. So when you look at the turn they've taken, it is very far from what Os Guinness, who I also just dearly love, the intent that he established for that organization when he founded it in the 90s.
Yep. All right. Critical race theory. Got to talk about critical race theory. So I love the fact that, first of all, you make clear that critical race theory is Marxist. But even more importantly, I loved what you said about why CRT is so at odds with Christianity. You have this beautiful quote, where Christianity teaches that mankind's greatest need is salvation from his sin, CRT teaches that it is power over his oppressors. And yet, so many churches have embraced CRT.
Yes. And in particular, and I made this defense in the book. I said, I do talk a lot about Southern Baptists. It's not just because I am one. It is because of their enormous footprint in evangelicalism. And they were certainly one of the institutions where you saw this most starkly. Their president in those few years from, I think it was 2019, 2020, 2021, those 3 years, J.D. Greear was a heavy advocate of not just using critical race terms, you heard him do that, but also really following the same arc that you saw in corporate culture in terms of embracing Black Lives Matter. He was somebody who has been out saying that he was going to implement, he didn't call it this, but this is what it was, DEI initiatives in his appointments within the Southern Baptist Convention. He promised that 2/3 of them would be either women or minorities. When you saw so many of the college campuses, some of these very blue urban areas tearing down their statues, J.D. Greear also moved to retire or suppress anything that came, pre-Civil War, even from people like Robert E. Lee's chaplain, who himself condemned slavery, and yet they were trying to erase the historical memory of these people. And so it was really interesting to see how closely they followed the arc of the dominant culture when it came to critical race theory. And in so many ways, you saw that same divisiveness in how it was implemented in the church. I interviewed people and I looked at the documents. This was absolutely happening, where churches were once again segregating their Bible studies, saying we are going to have Bible studies that are only for our minority members. White church members are not welcome to attend those Bible studies because they need to be a place of lament. So it's inherently divisive. I also had churches that were telling me about this Be the Bridge Bible study that they brought in that was very popular in a number of Southern Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches. And what it required was for white people to be silent in the group for the first 6 months and just do a whiteness 101 reading list. So very much struggle sessions, very much Marxist in its approach and in its fruit in terms of its divisiveness.
Okay, so having now been immersed for so long in this subject matter and having researched it so much, and you touch on so many other topics, and I'm sorry we don't have the time to get to them all, but they're in your book. I can't recommend it highly enough. What do you feel in the end, having looked at this so deeply? What is getting at these people? Is it purely financial? Is it wanting to be popular? Is it wanting to be part of the in crowd? What's your own feeling about what's causing this to happen?
Yeah, it's D, all of the above. So you see that deliberate influence coming in from left-wing power brokers, the money men, the George Soroses, the Bill Gates, the Pierre Omidyars. I mean, they openly talk about in some of their documents that their hope has been to harness the influence of these high-profile evangelical leaders so that if they will embrace progressive policy positions, that will trickle down to the pews. So that's part of it. But I do think there's also sort of the soft selling, the soft influence of the currency of respectability, of elitism, of being in those very elite Tony rooms that, so many of us, we don't have access to Davos or the WEF. And I think it does turn some heads. And I think there's also, the influence of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I can't tell you how often I will see Southern Baptist leaders, other evangelical leaders clearly flattered and just really, really grateful when they see these secular media outlets positively noticing them. So I think that's also a part of it. So it's all just kind of a big bowl of both literally selling out their ministries and also figuratively selling out to the spirit of the age.
So the book is Shepherds for Sale, How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. I feel like your book is in really good company. I'm thinking particularly of two other great thought leaders who have similarly tried to expose what's going on in the church. I'm thinking of Voddie Baucham's Fault Lines, which I loved. And then Owen Strachan, I think, has also been doing a lot of work here. So do you feel that books such as theirs and particularly yours, do you see them having an impact? Do you think that it's making a difference to be able to expose some of what's going on in the church?
Yeah, I think it is. And certainly not just my book, but those other books that you've mentioned, Voddie and Owen are just great champions of the truth. And I benefited so much from their work. And it was actually part of what probably emboldened me to pursue some of these stories, because it's important that people in the pews understand what's been going on so that it can be corrected. And so I was one of the people who was confused about what is this critical race there? What is going on? And those books helped me make so much sense of it. So that's given me a lot of courage. And, obviously there has been some pretty fierce pushback from institutional leadership to my book. I think probably Voddie and Owen experienced the same thing. So that's not unexpected. But what's been cheering is to see how many people who are just the ordinary average Christians in these churches, in these ministries, have been reaching out to me saying, yes, not just I believe what you're writing here, but I believe it because it dovetails with what I personally experienced. And so I don't think in many cases I was telling people so much that was new information to them in the sense of what's happening. What I provided was a roadmap to here's how it started to happen and why it's happening.
Well, thank you so much for writing this book. I think it takes great bravery and a lot of hard work and a lot of insight for exposing some of this incredible corruption amongst our religious leaders, our Christian leaders. I encourage you all to buy Megan's book, Shepherds for Sale, wherever you buy your books. You can follow her at Meg Basham on X, and you can follow her work at the Daily Wire. Follow me on Twitter at Gorka Katie, or my co-host who's not here today at Jennifer Horn. Thanks for listening. Share our podcast with your friends. Give us those 5-star reviews. We always appreciate them. And thanks for all of you happy women out there working to make our communities and our country great again. This has been another episode of the Happy Women Podcast.